Welcome to the last class of the semester. I want to begin. Thank you all for the good work you've done during what has been a very strange and weird semester of us bouncing back and forth between face to face and doing things remotely. It's a lot of weirdness, a lot of oddness. So we are at the end of it. Today we're going to try to make up for me getting sick last week. Our goal will be to cover the material that we would have covered during week 14. So that's chapter 11 in the textbook. So we'll go through that in-class activity. In addition to that, let me bring this up for a second. We also did on Tuesday, there was a sort of open invitation for everyone to come in to do the week 15 stuff, which is the stuff from chapter 16. If you weren't able to make that session, that's fine. There's a recording of it that I made that you can use. There won't really be that many questions on the final exam based on chapter 16, just a few conceptual questions, but you probably do want to go through the video at least, make sure you could tell me what an anomaly is, what falsifiability means, all that, some of the stuff we talked about in the context of chapter 16. There's no homework though, or in-class activity or anything for chapter 16. The in-class activity that we're going to be working on is this one, the week 14 in-class activity. Also, just wanted to make a note in this week 15 post-class assignments. So this one right here. If you open it up, there are two sort of study guides for the final exam, both of which might actually be helpful for today in the course of filling out the in-class activity. So we've got this document here. This is a full list of all of the biases that we're going to be talking about that will show up on the exam. And there's also a complete list of all of the fallacies that are sort of fair game for the final exam. The final exam won't really be cumulative, except for you'll need to know sort of all of the fallacies. So really the only things that are going to be talked about on the exam are chapter 11 and chapter 16, mainly just chapter 11, in fact. And then this is the list of all the fallacies, though, that you will need to know in the course of doing that. Pause for a second. Any questions with any of that? Any business questions, anything? Any questions on the final? Anything about the final? All right. Then let's start working on the week 11 in-class activity. The week 14 in-class activity. The reason I like to end the semester doing with chapter 11 is that it serves as a good kind of overview of the entire semester. We'll get to sort of talk about a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about, even going back to the very first day of class, with this basic idea of inquiry. Because that's really what the class is about. The sort of the presupposition of the class is that you sort of care about being rational, right? That you care about having good reasons for believing the things that you believe. And there's a lot of things that can go wrong, if that is indeed your desire, that are not merely logical problems. So what we've been talking about the semester really are logical difficulties, right? Fallacies, patterns of argumentation, and just tried to hone our sort of logical skills. But as was discussed in that chapter 11 video, other stuff goes into how we actually go about forming beliefs. And those other things, these sort of psychological factors, these social factors, and these cognitive factors, they can also kind of get in the way of our ability to be rational. We're going to call these a series of biases. They're not necessarily in and of themselves bad. And in some cases, actually, these biases will be beneficial, particularly some of the cognitive ones. But they can interfere with inquiry. And so if we really want to actually sort of work on having rational beliefs, right? Having beliefs that we believe because we have good reasons to believe them, right? We'll need to sort of be constantly on guard against these biases, right? Everyone's got them. They're operative in everyone. And so everyone sort of needs to be checking the sort of potentially negative impact that they can have on inquiry. So let's go to the whiteboard. All right. Here we've got our full list of biases. So we've talked about psychological biases. These are basically features or factors within our emotional lives, how we sort of like feel about stuff or process our feelings, process emotions, that in, again, many cases will be able to interrupt inquiry. Similarly, social biases, these are sort of features basically of group dynamics that can interfere with our ability to sort of evaluate evidence well. And then lastly, we have cognitive biases. These are actually literally features of how our brains process information. Frequently, they're useful, right? Well, as we'll talk about, like the representative bias is why you don't need to keep touching a hot burner, why touching it once isn't good enough, right? But all of them can sort of cause you to misprocess information under certain contexts or in certain settings. And so again, we'll need to be sort of on guard against the cognitive biases too. There'll be there'll be two main kinds of problems or questions on the exam dealing with chapter 11. The first set, if you look like the first couple problems in the in-class activity. So the first 6 of them, right? Where basically it's sort of analogous to the fallacy questions. I give you an exchange, dialogue, an argument, and you're going to be asked to identify kind of what bias is committed. So for problems of that first sort, so let's say number 1 as an example from the activity for today. And yeah, this will be where we'll start today. I'll have you all do this. I want you to do 2 things within this exchange. I want you to first sort of identify what bias is being manifested. And then just like if this was a fallacy problem, kind of define the bias. And then lastly, right, give me how can the bias, like, how is this specific argument doing the thing that that is contained within the definition? So basically, just a variant of the sort of same approach I was asking you to use when we were dealing with fallacies. What fallacy is it? What does that fallacy mean? How is the specific argument doing it? So why don't we take 1 or 2 minutes and you work on this for number 1. All right, and just like a lot of the problems we've been doing this semester, this is really a context where explaining your answer and going in depth is going to be important. You probably want to aim for, again, 2, 3, 4 sentences, something like that for these problems, because frequently it'll be possible to actually characterize the bias in multiple ways, or indeed multiple biases might be involved, might be correct in different ways. So how you sort of justify the answer that you give is how I'll be gauging it. In this particular case, I think at least the best of the biases to identify here, the one that's sort of most operative, is what we're going to call the my-side bias. So the my-side bias, what is it? It's basically our tendency just to be unaware of why people believe stuff that we ourselves don't believe. We tend to believe things and be aware of arguments that sort of are in support of things that we already believe, but we just know, if you want to put it this way, we know our side of the issue better than we know other sides. Right? And so in this particular case, right, we've got a speaker who is plainly sort of aware for arguments that are sort of against the existence of God, right? That's their position. They maybe even found these arguments compelling. Maybe that's why they don't believe in the existence of God, is because they heard these arguments, right? But they are not seemingly aware of what arguments could be presented on, so to speak, the other side. Right? They're not familiar with all the philosophers, the physicists, and theologians who argue that God does exist. And indeed, I teach philosophy of religion, I teach medieval philosophy. Take my word for it, there's a lot of these. Right? There are indeed a lot of efforts to offer proofs of this sort. Right? And so since they're just not aware of why people who do indeed believe in God, they simply assume that it's just blind faith, or that's just another way of saying, yeah, they're irrational, right? People who believe in God are irrational. They don't have any arguments. They don't have any evidence to support their view, right? But they only sort of come to that conclusion because they just don't know what those arguments are, right? They're not familiar with them. And so as a result of this bias, so this would be all you would need to say for the problem, right? It's just sort of stopping here, right? But as a result, it's also a good idea to note how the sort of the psychological bias, how it's going to interact with logical fallacies. This argument also kind of commits the straw person fallacy, right? The straw person fallacy is kind of a result. Mere blind faith is not the reason that many people who believe in God will offer for why they believe in God. They'll have more to offer than that. As a result, this is straw person fallacy. Their position is getting misrepresented, namely the reasons they have for believing what they believe. And there's a direct connection because the speaker is not sort of aware of why people believe what they believe. They thus misrepresent those beliefs. All right. So how are we doing with number one, this first problem? Any questions? Comments, thoughts, anything with anything we talked about here. Also, does anyone want to try out a different bias, see if you thought maybe some other bias was operative? We can try that out as well. Nothing? Good so far? All right, then let's do the exact same thing for number 2. Follow the exact same steps. All right. The bias here, I would say, seems like it's in the cognitive register, right? This person sort of has this experience or this memory, true memory, true experience, presumably, true enough, but they're sort of processing it incorrectly. They're sort of like deriving potentially flawed results from it and sort of rejecting other people's experiences. That's kind of a textbook example of what we're going to call the representative bias. The representative or the representativeness bias. This is basically the feature of our brains to assume that other people's experiences are basically the same as our own. And like I said, this is actually quite valuable, right? This is why when you touch a burner once, you don't need to keep touching it. You're sort of assuming that you're going to have the same experience every time. Similarly, that other people will also hurt their hand if they touch the hot burner too. So this is useful. Indeed, it would be weird, actually, probably, if you sort of thought that your experiences were radically unlike every other human being's, right? But where this becomes a bias or where this potentially becomes dangerous is where it leads sort of people to dismiss others who have had really different experiences, right? Because even if other people's experiences are similar to mine, that doesn't mean that they're the same, right? And that's sort of the mistake that seems to be taking place in this argument. The speaker is kind of assuming that their own experience is typical or representative of the experiences that everyone else has had. And so they're dismissing other people's experiences with poverty. And again, as a result, right, again, this isn't sort of necessarily part of the question, but it's just useful to note, they're also committing a logical mistake as well. This is the anecdotal evidence fallacy. They're over-privileging their own single data point, right, and giving it too much weight, giving it more weight than it sort of should get, right? And we can sort of see why, because they're sort of assuming that everyone else had the same experience, right? Even though there's every reason to think that maybe other people have had very different experiences with poverty. And so that this one individual person's experience isn't representative of all people's experience. All right. Questions, thoughts, comments, anything with number 2? Any other bias as well that anyone wants to try out? All right, let's go to 3. All right, here we seem this to be describing in this particular exchange a function of how groups work. Like, this seems like it's kind of some a social thing. Maybe how, let's say, a professional group, professional environment, how those things sort of run and are operated. I actually got this argument from argument. Maybe he's overstating it. I got this exchange anyway from a podcast. Actually, it was someone interviewing one of the very first female editors at the Washington Post, and she made this argument in the interview that sort of like there was a particular standard of dress that women should sort of just be expected to hold to, and the justification was kind of just that, like, that's how it's done, right? That's how that group operates. That's an example of what we call inside the box thinking. Right? This is sort of related to, in some sense, something I'm going to talk about later, identification with beliefs. This is sort of the social version of it. Right? Within groups, there's a tendency to just assume that how a group operates is how the group should operate, without kind of any sort of justification or with any defense, as if it was sort of, again, natural or kind of normal, right? And that as a result of this, people don't necessarily feel the need to sort of defend why groups operate the way that they do. But we could easily imagine someone wanting to challenge this convention, say, hey, this is merely a convention. It's not natural. It's not normal. Maybe it's bad. Maybe there should be broader dress codes or whatever, right? And someone in the sort of the grip of sort of the inside the box thinking bias is just not going to almost see the need to defend why the group functions in the way that it does. And the danger there, of course, is that you sort of can cut off inquiries before they even begin, right? You'll treat things as natural, normal, and obvious that actually to someone else not part of the group doesn't seem natural, normal, and obvious at all. All right. Any questions with number 3? Great. Let's keep moving. Let's go to number 4 then. All right, here we see sort of, I would say, a textbook example of defensiveness, right? Of a person, so person A, or sort of initial speaker, right? They're offering a critique of evidence, in a sense, right? A critique of a conclusion, a critique of an argument, right? Suggesting that, the paper, I don't think it works. I don't think the paper supports the conclusion, Right? Person B is interpreting this as kind of a personal attack. And whether it is or is not is actually almost irrelevant, right? By interpreting it as a personal attack, person B is sort of completely incorrectly responding to the actual issue that person A is raised, right? The actual issue is this a good or bad argument? By getting defensive, person B has completely shifted the topic away from whether or not the argument is or is not a good argument, right? And again, as a result, you could say they've committed the straw person fallacy again, right? They've fallen into a logical mistake as sort of misrepresenting what it is that person A has actually said as a result of their sort of tendency to rush into a kind of a defensive posture rather than one that actually sort of engages with the sort of objections that person A maybe has, right? I mean, let's be honest, none of us like to have someone say that we're wrong. None of us like to be criticized, right? But defensiveness is kind of the worst possible way of responding to criticism, especially from the standpoint of logic, right? Because it's going to inevitably lead away from the actual logical issues at place, which is whether or not the criticism is actually warranted. All right. Any questions with 4? All right, let's go to 5 then. We'll do 2 more problems like this. All right, in this problem, I think we're sort of remaining in the psychological register. There's a certain kind of sort of like emotion or whatever sort of manifested, I think, in person B's response. But here we see a different bias manifested. We see the bias, it's called ideological fixity. So what I mean by an ideology isn't anything particularly fancy. Ideologies are kind of frameworks that people use to sort of interpret the world, right? And they're frequently useful. Having an ideological framework is not necessarily a bad thing. They can be quite helpful, in fact. But the danger in ideological fixity is sort of like not seeing the ideology as something that itself is in need of justification or that would be in need of defense, right? And so sort of just applying it in an uncritical way. Right? And that's sort of what person B is doing here, right? They sort of just always say the same thing whenever you ask a question, right? A way you could sort of put ideological fixity is it's sort of when you know the answer before you even ask the question, right? Because you're always going to give the exact same answer, whatever the question is. And yeah, we can all look at sort of like, cable news personalities or whatever. We don't need to name names, right? But there's a lot of them where you don't even really need to check in to see what the topic of the day is because they're going to say the same thing every time, right? They say the same thing to every topic or say the same thing about every question, right? And so looking, it almost doesn't matter what the specific topic is. Whereas the sort of logical question here almost seems to be, is this kind of, if you want to call this like a hawkish foreign policy, is that actually the right response in this specific circumstance, right? That's actually what's relevant. That's actually what matters. If you already know the answer before you ask, you're not going to actually evaluate the relevancy of the ideology in the particular situation. And that is the thing that's almost always logically called for. Right? So the issue is not having an ideological framework. The issue is not being willing to evaluate whether or not that framework is appropriate to the particular circumstance or the particular issue that's being dealt with within, again, an argument or an exchange. All right. Any questions with number 5? All right, great. Then let's do one last problem of this sort, number 6. Then we'll do a different kind of problem for the rest of the day. All right. Here again, this sounds to me like a cognitive bias of some sort. That something is sort of, person A is sort of listening in to this sort of scientist present the results of some sort of study, and they're just not quite processing the information in the right way. I would say the specific bias that's taking place here is a kind of overconfidence bias. So overconfidence bias is basically the tendency of our brains to latch on to ideas more firmly than is supported by the evidence that suggests or supports the idea, right? And that certainly seems to be what's taking place here, right? There's this sort of study that's presented, this evidence that under certain circumstances, drinking too much coffee is dangerous, right? So the idea that sort of sticks in our minds from that is coffee is dangerous, right? Which is probably a sort of one, a kind of an oversimplification, but two, also sort of an exaggeration of what the evidence actually suggests. There's sort of two different ways overconfidence bias tends to manifest. One way that it can manifest is just sort of believing things, and this is what's taking place here, believing a more extreme version of a belief than the evidence actually supports, because a more extreme version of a belief requires more extreme evidence, basically, it requires more evidence. Here, again, if we assume this is I made this up, but if we assume this is true, right, then there would indeed be some reason to think that you shouldn't drink too much coffee, maybe, but that's interpreting that as coffee will kill you, right, is again, an exaggerated version of the claim, right? The other version of overconfidence bias is where a person sort of holds to some belief more firmly than is justified by the evidence. They sort of go hand in hand, right? Yeah. All right. So any questions with number 6? All right. So when you see a question like this one on the exam, and again, there'll be questions like this on the final, especially if you've been having difficulty with time constraints on the exam, one thing I really recommend doing is sort of not over answering a question, right? These kinds of questions we've been talking about, they basically require 2 to 4 at most sentences to sort of do an adequate answer to. The next kind of problem we're going to talk about actually is going to require way more. They're worth way more points as a result. And so sort of keep those 2 different kinds of questions in mind so that you don't end up spending too much time on questions that are sort of only worth 3 points and then too little time at the end for questions that are worth more points. So let's look at number 7. Number 7 is an example of a sort of question that I'm going to ask for a little bit more from you for, right? So for questions of the second sort, there's basically going to be 3 stages to your answer. So first stage, you're going to be given an argument that commits a fallacy of some sort, identify what fallacy has been committed by the argument, and then give some sort of justification or defense of why. Could be a little bit shorter maybe than normal, but at least like a sentence or 2 justifying the fallacy. Again, 1 sentence or so, maybe 2 at the most. Right. Second thing, the fallacy that takes place within the exchange that the argument is manifesting will have some sort of bias that seems to be motivating it from this sort of list that we've been describing. So your second task is going to be to identify the bias that motivates the fallacy, and again, give sort of a brief explanation. So that's the second step. And then the last thing I'll want you to do for this kind of problem is come up with a response to the argument. Think of it sort of as like a narrative response. Like imagine someone's making the fallacy to you or making this argument to you. How could you respond to it such that you both respond to the logical mistake that's getting made, so that respond to the fallacy, but also sort of as a helpful response to sort of move the person away from the bias that was leading them to make the fallacy? And the reason why sort of that this will be the most of the points probably on the final exam will be problems like this. And the reason why is because let's be let's real talk for a second, right? Have any of you ever like been having an argument with someone, and I don't necessarily mean a fighting argument, but like a logic argument with someone, and like ever been like, oh well, that's just the post hoc fallacy, ha 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 ha. Does that go well? No, that doesn't go well, right? More is going on with people than just logic. To actually respond well to people, you can't just respond to the purely logical concerns that are present, right? A fruitful response to inquiry is going to have to, in addition to the logic, also be aware of these other factors. And so I want us to get some practice with sort of coming up with ways of actually responding in sort of quasi real world cases, right, to instances of bad reasoning when we encounter them. All right, so any questions about what I'm going to be looking for with problems like this? All right, so like I said, on the exam, these problems are going to be worth quite a few more points, 5 or 6 points, right? Which means that I'm going to expect you to spend 5 or 6 points on the problem, right? We're talking a good, couple paragraphs, or not maybe a couple paragraphs, maybe a little bit, but at the very least, a really solid 4, 5, 6, 7 sentences, probably for problems like this, right? We won't necessarily take all that time today doing the in-class activity, but I will give you a little bit longer, at least a minute or two, to try to write through. So for number 7, I want you to try to do all 3 of these steps: identify the fallacy, identify the bias, and then come up with some kind of narrative response. Again, there'll be lots of different ways of doing this. It's not just one answer here, but try to do all 3 of these steps. And I'm going to go actually run real fast and get some water while you're doing that. All right, let's start working our way through this. So first, what fallacy do we see committed here? I would say this seems to be a very clear case of the slippery slope fallacy. Slippery slope fallacy is where you sort of reach unreasonable conclusions, right? Or unreasonable consequences, rather, and don't justify those consequences as a sort of outlandishly bad consequences within the argument itself. And that's what we see here, right? Taking care of a child every time they cry, right? A baby, especially when they cry, going from there to ending up in prison, right? Seems to be an enormous leap, sort of an outlandishly bad result, and the argument doesn't really draw the lines connecting that outlandishly bad result to the initial action, right, to the initial behavior. But and again, frequently when you see these fallacies, they're really obvious, right? Like it's unclear. My guess is none of you read this and was like, yeah, that makes sense. Right? This is good reasoning here, right? Something seems off. Again, that's why they're fallacies. There's frequently a really obvious mistake getting made, but why was the mistake compelling in this case, right? Why did the person sort of fall prey to it? I think it's because there's more than just the bias taking place, or sorry, more than just the fallacy taking place. There's also a cognitive bias taking place, and here I'd say it's what's called the availability and vividness bias. This is our tendency to sort of overprivilege information and evidence that made a big impact on us in some way, right? So particularly memorable experiences, particularly sort of shocking or maybe traumatic or painful events, they stick with us. Our brains can just literally more easily recall those experiences than other experiences, right? Other experiences that don't make as much of an impact. And that seems to be what's taking place here, right? Our sort of speaker in this case has a very sort of available and vivid memory that they're perhaps overprivileging the significance of, right? Of the sort of bad experiences of their childhood with sort of a spoiled brother ending up in jail. Right? And so because of the way in which that memory is sort of like present and ready to be recalled, available for recall, the person is sort of falling into this logical mistake of just assuming that that same thing is going to happen in all circumstances, where indeed, again, it's pretty outlandish in this case, right? And so a response that would, it's not going to be enough or do very much just to say, well, this is the slippery slope fallacy, right? The fallacies don't seem fallacious to the person who's making them. And so maybe something like this would be a better response, or a response maybe in a more sort of productive kind of direction, right? Like, and again, this is just an example. There's other ways of saying similar kinds of things. Maybe something like this, though, right? Like, I know that your experience with your brother was really traumatic, right? Sort of like acknowledge and motivate and recognize the sort of presence of the availability and vividness bias, right? And I agree we should avoid spoiling our child, right? Fine, right? But then we sort of respond to the logical issues as well, right? Just taking care of a child when they cry doesn't mean that what happened to your brother will happen in this particular case, right? So trying to work on both sides, correcting the logical mistake, but also sort of working on why that mistake was committed in the first place. All right. So how are people feeling with this other kind of question? Any thoughts, any questions, comments, anything about the fallacy, the bias, or what kind of response I'm looking for? All right, we'll do two more examples. So let's look at number 8. Number 8, I sort of think of as The Office. Michael Scott from The Office is sort of who I imagine giving this particular argument. All right. So start here. What's our bias? The bias is the red herring fallacy, right? The actual issue at play in this sort of exchange or in this situation is the issue of giving employees raises, right? Whether or not the employees should or should not be given raises, right? A red herring is just anytime you sort of distract from the real issue, right, by bringing up just irrelevant details, right? And if the question is, do the employees deserve raises? It's not really relevant whether or not they make a good product, whether their customer service is good, right? These details about the company are kind of just irrelevant to the issue of whether the employees should or should not get raises. Right. So why is this fallacy being committed? Well, one possibility is that it's being committed deliberately, right? This was sort of a deliberate distraction tactic to sort of, try to confuse the employees or whatever, get them to not notice or not think about the raises that they're not getting. But in this case, and again, I sort of think of this as the sort of the office a little bit, right? Like something else seems to be going on here, right? We seem to have a sort of an example of what we call the identification with beliefs bias, one of the psychological biases. Right? And this bias is where believing in something becomes a large part of a person's sort of sense of self or sense of identity, who or what it is that they are. It's a little bit related, like I said, it's sort of the individual version of inside the box thinking in this case. And that kind of seems to be being manifested here. Right? It seems to be really important to this manager that people think he's a good boss and that the company is a good company. It's sort of like part of how he sees himself is that he is this. And so is sort of like when exposed to sort of contrary evidence, like not giving employees raises, his mind just kind of goes to want to talk about irrelevant stuff that makes him feel better about himself in a very real sense, right? Stuff that sort of shifts toward a topic he's more familiar with or more comfortable with, probably in this case, right? And so again, response is going to have to work in both directions, hit both sort of sides of why this fallacy is taking place, both the logical mistake and the bias. And again, maybe here's an example of something that could do that, right? But if the company makes such good products and has such good customer services, shouldn't the employees be rewarded for making the company such a good place, right? Where again, you're sort of responding to the fallacy, we're shifting the conversation back to the real issue, which is raises, but also sort of trying to deal with the way in which, this boss is sort of like fixated on the idea of being a good employee, being a good boss, a good employer. Well, okay, then fine, you should act like one. Right? You should do the things that good bosses do, and that means giving employees raises if that's what they've earned, if the company is as good as you say that it is. All right. Again, thoughts, questions, number 8? All right, then let's do one more example. Number 9. All right. So here again, I think we see an example of sort of an obvious mistake, right? An obvious fallacy. And here I'd say we're looking at the post hoc fallacy. That didn't work. Sorry. Let me try copy pasting again. There we go. Better. So yeah, we seem to have the post hoc fallacy, right? This, so going back to our chapter 5 causal argument stuff, right? birds are just not the right kind of thing, or a bird flying by the window is not the right kind of thing to cause a computer to crash, right? The person is sort of assuming it simply because the bird flew by right before the event took place, but it's not a credible candidate. It's not the right kind of thing. And so we're looking at an example here of the post hoc fallacy of a kind of coincidence. But again, this is, again, my guess is though you're all like, yeah, that's really obvious, right? But it's obviously not obvious to person A, right? Person A seems to think this is an entirely sensible conclusion to come to. Why? What's justifying or motivating the post hoc fallacy in this case? It's another cognitive bias, I would say. In this case, it's confirmation bias. Right? Confirmation bias is the tendency of, again, literally just how our brains work. Our brains work in such a way that we tend to only look for and accept evidence that confirms what it is we already believe. Our brains, you want to put it this way, are not interested in evidence that really like rocks the boat. We tend to be way more dismissive of it than evidence that actually confirms what it is we already believe. And hence the name, hence confirmation bias. We look for confirmation of things. And again, this is frequently sensible that our brains work this way. I mean, there's a lot of times, if I was to argue right now that the best way for you to get an A in your exam is to like take up juggling, your brain should be like, that sounds pretty stupid. I'm not going to listen to that. Right? There's, generally speaking, the way we go about navigating the world, we go about navigating the world for new reasons. New things maybe even should have a higher burden of proof. But where this becomes a problem, where confirmation bias becomes a problem, is that frequently the reasons we have for believing things weren't that good to begin with. A lot of our beliefs are sort of forged for bad reasoning, right? With little evidence, with no evidence in many cases. Right? And that's kind of what's taking place here. So since this person has this sort of poorly formed hypothesis that animals cause them bad luck, when they go back and think about their experiences, the only things they can remember are things that sort of confirm that hypothesis. Right? And so they're not paying attention to all of the other experiences that they probably had with animals in their life, right? All the sort of obvious counterexamples of times that they've been around animals and nothing bad happened. Indeed, they're not even looking for any evidence of that sort. They're just looking for things to confirm what it is that they already believe. And so confirmation bias is actually one of the more tricky and difficult ones to deal with. Just pointing out the fallacy is actually usually not helpful. It's usually not gonna work in this case. So what you would need to do to start is actually just work on the confirmation bias itself. Try to get the person to sort of recognize and almost just acknowledge evidence that sort of challenges their thesis or challenges their hypothesis. Right? Because until they're willing to evaluate that evidence, to them it's going to seem entirely reasonable that the bird caused the computer to crash, right? Because they're only looking at evidence that confirms that, right? You're going to have to sort of break that first. And so some kind of approach where you sort of try to get the person to acknowledge counter evidence, that's probably the best bet in this particular case. All right. So any questions on any of the problems we've gone over, any of the biases, any questions on anything with the exam? Any questions on anything with anything? Is this the last sort of official meeting we have of the semester?
Nope.
All right, awesome. Then let's end up a little bit. So I said a little bit of this in the on Tuesday with the chapter 16 video. And again, remember you can go in Canvas to go if you weren't able to make the session, you can go. All right, find this recording of it right there. But I'll repeat some of the stuff that I sort of do for the sort of end of the semester kind of stuff. Again, like I said at the beginning, just thank you all for the work you've done. This was a challenging semester. It's been a challenging year. Maybe been challenging longer than that, depending on how you want to count. So I'm really appreciate all the work you've put in, sort of sticking with things through those difficulties. This class comes with what I sort of call a lifetime guarantee. If there's anything any of you need from me going forward, please don't hesitate to let me know what it is. Right? If you need letters of recommendation, if you just want to talk about philosophy, or if you want to talk about anything. If there's anything I can do for you, I'm here to teach. I'm at CSU to teach. I do other stuff, but I do other stuff because I sort of have to. But this is the good stuff. This is the stuff that I'm actually here for. So you're not going to be bothering me. Don't worry about anything like that. If there's anything I can do for you going forward, please don't hesitate. Let me know what it is. Other thing, I would I really value student feedback on the course, particularly when you have weird semesters like this one was. I mean, it's sounding like fall is going to be pretty normal, which is awesome. I really hope that's the case. But in case something weird happens and we got to shift back and forth again, it would be really valuable information for me to know what you all thought worked and what didn't work, and what I can sort of change to make transitions, if we have weird transitions like we had to have this year, go better. Right. And both positive and negative is useful, actually, right? Like what did I do that worked? What was still confusing? What could have been clarified better? All of that information would be incredibly valuable for me. The student course evaluations are up. They're in Canvas. You should be able to get to them right, from this tab. This should give me an error message because I'm not actually a real student, but hopefully at least you don't get an error message. You should just get course evaluations when you click there. And if you could fill those out, I'd really appreciate it. Like I said, you'll be helping future generations, if nothing else. And I really do value the feedback. I really do take it to heart and try to change things on the basis of it. You know, hopefully next semester will be normal, but who knows? Life comes at us fast. And that'll be open throughout the rest of the semester. So students will have a chance to fill those out. I'll probably send out some email reminders about them as well. But also, I'm going to leave you the rest of the class day today to work on to fill those out too. Yeah, I think that's it for me. Does anyone have any last things for me?
Thank you.
All right, awesome. Have a wonderful rest of the semester, everyone. Enjoy. And yeah, I'll be holding office hours like normal on Friday. I'll probably also hold them like normal on Monday. And then I can make appointments any other time people want to meet up.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good summer.
You too.
All right, thank you.
Absolutely.